right, so welcome to our session on Teaching with Google, where we'll cover a few creative uses for Google in your classes. My name is Stephanie Getz, and I'm an instructional technologist with the Digital Media Projects Office, and I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves.
I'm Michelle Schwartz, and I'm an educational developer with the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching.
And I'm Sally Goldberg Powell, also an instructional technologist with the e-learning team at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching.
Thank you. And we also have some of our colleagues from the center helping us answer questions in the chat today. And so here's our agenda. We've selected a few tools in Google Workspace that can be leveraged for teaching. Now keep in mind, there are so many different tools that we could probably spend weeks covering them, but we've picked a few things that we like to recommend, especially if this is your first time really digging into using Google as a collaborative tool. So we'll start off with Google Docs for facilitating collaborative class activities, Google Forms, and Google Drive and Google Groups to create course shared folders. Next slide, please. So you might be asking, why are we recommending Google? We have a variety of tools that we use at Ryerson, including things like D2L Brightspace and Zoom. So why are we recommending a collection of Google features? The first thing is that it is Ryerson supported. So the university has adopted Google, and it is now called Google Workspace for Education, if you're not up on the name change. And we do provide support. So Ryerson provides support from a number of places. CCS provides the centralized technical support for most Google questions. And then those of us in the center, we do provide some advice and some support in terms of how we can leverage Google tools for our teaching purposes. It's free to use and available to all students and staff and faculty as well. You connect with your Ryerson username and password, the same as you do for D2L Brightspace, and it is accessible. So we have our accessibility experts have reviewed things as a part of our bringing on Google, and for the most part, the features are fairly accessible. So secondly, it provides live and asynchronous collaboration. Over the last year and a half doing remote learning, that has been an absolute necessity because we haven't been able to be in person. So we want to make sure that we can create activities, that we can run in real time online, as well as on our own time. So the different collaborative features of Google do allow you to do both of those things. And you can also control who has access to what at what time. So you can control whether your students have access to resources or not. You can decide whether they can just view these resources or whether they can collaborate and edit those resources. And that's something we'll be covering further down in the session. And because it's such a widely used suite of tools, there's a lot of documentation and a large community of users with experience using it. So if you're working on something on a weekend and the support teams aren't available to answer your questions, just Google your question, and I'm sure a lot of people have run into the same things. And the last point that I want to make is that asterisk at the bottom. We do still have some students and some faculty that are accessing from outside of Canada. And there are some countries in which Google is not really approved. So if you or your students are accessing from overseas, from a location where Google may be blocked, you can use global.ryerson.ca to access Ryerson's Google Workspace tools. And with that, we'll turn it over to Michelle.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Stephanie. I'm going to talk for a bit about sharing and collaborating specifically within Google Docs, although the great thing about all the Google products is that they are widely able to be shared and collaborated in. That's the whole benefit of them, as Stephanie elaborated on. So one thing to keep in mind is that if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to have students going to multiple different places, I don't want to have this Google Drive and then my D2L course shell, is that you can embed, like for instance, Google Docs directly into your D2L Brightspace. So you can, use the document for collaborative note taking each week or to have a class FAQ, and the students can look at it right from within your course shell. So you can just build it into each module, maybe a note-taking document or some lecture notes or things that the students collaborate on, and then they can access it from within D2L without having to find a separate place and keep track of things in different folders. You can also create templates for students to use. So, you know, if you're giving the students a specific assignment and you want to make sure that everything comes back looking roughly the same, and it's really just the content that you're assessing, and you don't have to worry that the students didn't put in the correct sections or didn't follow instructions about what the works cited sections should look like, you can create these templates and the students can make a copy of them. And then just all they have to worry about is the actual content and the research and the writing that they do, and not so much that they've, you know, made it look the way that is intended. And I've talked to a lot of students who often are told like, oh, that your paper should be APA and it should have a running head. And they never know what that means, and they're panicking. What's a running head? How do I put it on? Like, how do I even get it to be there? And they're like individually typing the running head onto each page of the document, right? This is something that you can kind of give them a template. They can see what it's supposed to look like. They can learn how the things are done, but they don't have to stress about getting it correct. So there's two different ways of doing this, one of which is new. There's the simplest way, which is, you know, you could send them a link to the document and then they can just go to file, make a copy. And when I did this for grad students that I was teaching in our grad student development program, you know, I put that note in red at the top, you know, don't edit this file, to create your own proposal template, file, make a copy, just to make sure that they like saw it and they did it without editing the main file. But there's also an interesting new way of doing things, which I can demo later, which is using a URL. So you just change the end of the URL on your file from, you know, \edit to template/preview. And then like what will happen is when the student goes to the link, it'll just prompt them to create the template without having to go to your master file and potentially muck around in it. So two different ways, both of which are pretty simple to create a template for the students to do their assignments. You can also use Google to support collaborative work. So, you know, facilitating group work or peer assessment or providing formative feedback to students by having shared documents with them. And I've highlighted a few ideas here, but certainly there's lots of different ways this can be done. So for instance, you can create folders for groups. So say you divide the students into groups that they're going to be working in throughout the entire course. You just create a shared folder for them. You share it with just the group members and yourself. And then you can drop templates in there. You can go in and see what they're working on. If for whatever reason, one group member feels that the other ones haven't contributed, for instance, as much, you can go in and see what's been going on and who's done what work and how. You can show students sort of how to work collaboratively on a document. So for instance, how to comment and assign tasks to one another with comments or suggest edits to each other's work. So it's a really kind of robust tool for kind of teaching a peer review process, for getting students to work together on writing. You can use the comments tool similarly to provide feedback. So you could go in when they have a draft form and give them a little bit of formative feedback or guidance about how things are going and what you might expect to see. They've also added a new tool called checklists. So it's similar to the bullet points and lists, but it actually has a little checkbox that you can actively check off and it'll cross out the task. And I just mocked up a simple example here on the right side of the slide showing 3 different group members and say they each had to create a list of tasks together that they were responsible for. And then they could have this shared sort of work breakdown structure that they could visit and see what is still needs to be done and then what's been done by the other group members. So they could have a little bit of built-in accountability as well as sort of work tracking. And then they could, you know, check off all the things that they've done. And maybe they even hand in the list to you at the end to say like, oh, we've done all these things. You can also facilitate visual work. So Google Docs is a pretty standard kind of word processing program with not even as robust features as, for instance, like Word, but you know, it is word processing. So if you're teaching in a more visual field, or you want to do students to do things like mind mapping or brainstorming, there's also 2 different Google tools that you could consider, and I've linked them here for you to review later, which are Google Draw and Google Jamboards. So with Jamboards, it's kind of like a good place to do like a visioning exercise, dropping Post-it notes and pictures, like inspiration. And Draw is more of like a robust drawing tool, but both of which you could use to do kind of more visual work with students. Oops. One thing to keep in mind with regard to accessibility is that there is the ability to kind of both, build accessibility for screen readers and things like that into your documents, as well as kind of create a set of dynamic links that you can use to direct students to information. So if you use the heading structures, so like for instance, saying that the title is an H1, heading 1, and the subtitle is H2, then you can automatically generate a table of contents that will actually create links for you to use. So you can share links to jump down to a particular section with your students, and it updates automatically and also creates accessibility in your teaching. And I'll demo this all in a bit, but I just wanted to like go through the ideas, and then I'll show you how it works. It's really easy and it's really helpful. Like, so this particular example on the right hand side of the screen is a document that we were developing sort of over the course of the last year. So we kept adding to it as we got more tips and tricks and strategies shared with us by faculty members. And so, I had the table of contents that was generated from the headings, so that if I wanted to send a link to a section to someone who asked us a question or asked for advice, I could just send them directly to it. And it kind of created the ability to have this document that was constantly growing and changing, but always stayed organized. Finally, you can track the writing process with version control features. So you can lead students through a process of drafts and revisions. And you can do that through a few different tools. One is the suggesting mode. So that's similar to Word's track changes. So, if you make a change to the document, it crosses out what you deleted in a color representing, you instead of, like, someone might be purple and you're pink, and someone else is green. And then you can add in, the new content, and then you get a sense of what's been changed. And you can approve or reject the changes. So you could either, work on that with students where they actually have a chance to go through and suggest changes to each other's work, and then the other student can accept or reject the change. Or you can just kind of like give them a sense of how they can revise a draft of their own work over time. Google also has version history built in. So you could have the ability to see who has done what work on which document and how much. So once again, like if you have, issues with groups arguing over who did what work, or, maybe even something that could potentially be plagiarism or things like that, you can go into the version history and see exactly all the work that each student has done in a document. And you can also give them a sense of like how to kind of work on a draft process for writing. So they can create named versions. So they could say draft 1, and then draft 2, and then final. And you as the faculty member could go in and access all the drafts, and then kind of give them some feedback about their writing process or how things have gone. So there's lots of different ways that you could think about doing things. They even have a sort of compare documents tool now, that allows you to have 2 different documents side by side and see, what's different between them. So it's really like a good way of tracking student work, and also giving them the ability to learn the editing process. And now I'll just take a minute to just demo some of these tools. Hold on, I have to hide my Zoom toolbar because I can't see. Okay, do people see the Google Doc now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So here's just a blank Google Doc. I use it over and over again, and I just started over. Annika, do you have a question? I saw that you raised your hand.
That was by accident, Michelle. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So it's just a general Google page. So for instance, right here we have a Google demo tutorial, and you can see here that was set as heading 1. And then these points here: use heading structure, create templates for students to use, encourage collaborative work, and track the writing process, are all heading 2. You can see them up here in this little drop-down menu. So now if I say insert table of contents down here, and I just pick this one, I'll get this little table of contents. And then if I click on the link, you get this opportunity to actually copy the link to this section of the document so that if you have a very long document, you can drop right down to that section. So then if I say create students templates for students to use and share with others, and then I come back up here and hit refresh, it will update the table of contents as well, which is just really handy for saving you work and effort. So that's how you can think about using the heading structure, table of contents, and direct links to improve accessibility. So for the creating templates for students to use, like I said earlier, if you just go to File, make a copy here, you'll get one of these menus where students are able to just say, take their copy, they could rename it, Google Doc template Michelle, and then they could move it over to their Google Drive to work on. You can also change the URL. Do people see the URL bar on here?
Yeah, we can see it. It's a little bit small, but we can see it.
Okay, and this is where you would change the URL here. I think it's what is it, Sally? It's template/preview.
That's right, template/preview.
And so if I click template/preview here on the end link, I now have a preview of, oh, whoa. Preview of the document. And there's a button at the top that says use template. And if I click on that, it's now sort of created my own doc to me that I could save in a new in my Google Drive and work on as my template. So you could do either way, and it's a handy way to get students to use templates. So then in terms of encouraging collaborative work with assigned comments, shared folders, and checklists. So I'm gonna click here, this little button on the toolbar, checklist, and I could say share document with Sally, tell Stephanie to send email, and walk the dog. Now I have this checklist. If I walked the dog this morning, so I can check it off. I can actually highlight Stephanie's name, say add comment, and I could say at Stephanie, assigned to Stephanie, don't forget the email, and I can assign it. Oh, I need to give Stephanie access to the file. So these are like some of the ways that you can kind of set up a collaborative work with things like comments, assigned comments, or checklists. And finally, tracking the writing process with the version control features. So if I go into editing up here and say suggesting mode instead, and this is just a quick demo, but there's links in the slides for all of these things. If I add some text here, you can see that it's highlighted as a change. And then if I say I don't want this idea anymore and delete it, you'll see it says now I deleted shared document with Sally, and you have the opportunity to accept or reject the change. So this is a way that you could have students work collaboratively. Instead of just deleting each other's work, you could have them always do the suggesting mode so that there's no kind of conflicts about what was there and what wasn't. And then if you go to file, version history, and see version history, then you'll be able to see all the changes that were made and when, and you can actually name the version and say this was draft 1 of my work. And then maybe every time the student wants to show you another draft, they can name another draft, and they could say in office hours, I want us to go through draft 2 to see what you think of my changes. So that's just a very, very quick overview of these tools. I hope you find it interesting, and we can definitely talk more about it after Sally and Stephanie have a chance to go through their sections. Stephanie, do you want me to stop sharing my slides?
Actually, it's me. So yeah, that would be great, actually.
Okay, 1 second.
No problem. I think we're good, right? Am I sharing now? Do we see?
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so this section's about Google Forms. I often joke that it's my middle name now, Sally Google Forms Goldberg Powell. That's a lot to say. I've used them a lot in my own teaching. I teach first year journalism students, and it's about 150 students per semester. So I find this to be a really helpful tool to track some amount of participation. So I use it to generate different types of forms to track different types of participation that I give them what I call class engagement points for. And basically, they're responsible for getting about, if they want to get full marks, they need 10 of these points, but I give them about 20 options for different ways to do it. And every time that they submit, they use a Google form to do so. So I've used them in a lot of different ways, and there are a lot of different ways that you can use them past these as well. The great thing about the forms is they can be used for forms, surveys, or quizzes. So they can be used in all 3 different ways. They can be set to anonymous, or you can require a Google ID like your Ryerson email, and you can also use that to identify the respondent. So it uses their user ID. This means that if you're using it this way, they do need to be signed in to their My Ryerson account and the Google areas using their Google account. And a lot of them have personal Google accounts. So Stephanie will give some tips on making sure that that's the way that they've been set up so that they are filling it in correctly. And if you set it up basically that they have to have a Ryerson account in order to fill it out, they'll just be prompted and told that that's what they need to do before they can fill it in. You can add fields to create the form. So some of these fields might just be like information or a photo or a video. They don't all have to be question fields, but there are multiple options for question types. And I've listed those along the right-hand side there for you. So you can see all the different ones there. One that I find really useful, and I'll talk about a bit more, is the file upload. So this offers a way of them submitting a file as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be responses to questions. And you are able to also add fields separated by sections. So you can separate into different sections, which will basically make different pages. So you have to fill in one page of stuff and then you hit a next button to get to the next one. This is also a good way to put in a pause or a stop and reflect or something in between different steps in a process. So if you have a longer form, you can do that. And one thing that I've done in one of the forms that you'll see is I have a Q&A form that I created for assignment. So they can ask a question about the assignment and then they can see each other's responses. And in that one, on the first page where it explains what this form is for, it also says stop, make sure you've actually read the assignment, looked at the rubric, and that you look at the responses to the form that have already come through before you ask a question. And that way it's just a reminder to double check everything before you ask a question. And that helps to limit the number of questions coming through the form and just make sure that they are more unique questions coming through the form. So when you're gathering responses, you can do 2 different ways to send the form to your students. You can actually send it via email or provide a link. Using the link is usually what I do. And I could put that onto my D2L Brightspace, for example, or share it even in the chat during a live session, depending. Or I've put them into Google Docs as well. So if I have instructions, I want to provide them in a Google Doc. And then once they've read the instructions, they click the form. That's another way I've done it in class, especially. If it's online work, I would put it onto D2L, but if it's in class and I want to send them a link to the instructions, I can put them in a Google Doc followed by the link to the form. And then now the forms, we have a beta test that's going on, and that because we're in a Workspace for Education, we have access to this, where if they're signed in with their Ryerson account, it will actually save their progress in the form, which is nice. So again, it's in beta, so when things are in beta, I don't always 100% trust that they're going to work perfectly. So I wouldn't rely on this process, but it does mean that students can start filling in a form and it'll write that little save as draft at the top, or it'll say saved at the top, sort of like you might be familiar with other Google applications, and it will save their progress as they go. So that's a nice new feature that's available. You can also set it to send them a receipt when they're done. So again, this has become something that I rely on a lot, because that way, if we miss giving them a participation point, they have a receipt in their email that they can forward to let us know, because I have TAs filling them in. So the TA can actually get the receipt sent to them to say, yeah, I did do it. Here's my proof, right? So the students have proof that they completed it. The receipt also provides them with the responses they gave, so they can double check what they had written, or they can review it later if they want to look at their responses again. And you can also set up the form to send an email to you when there's a new submission. So that's going to be annoying if you've got 150 students who are sending in things all the time. You get 150 emails that there's new responses, but I do turn it on when I'm using my Q&A form for the assignment. So I know when there's been a new question about the assignment. They usually come in 2 or 3 a day, and so it's not as big of a deal. And that way I know to go double check and see what the new questions are and answer the question. So it is an option depending on the way you're using the form. And then, yeah, I'm just going to go to the next one. Again, I have a little bit more information about the saving your work here on this slide. After you've submitted, had all the submissions come in, then you want to view the results. And this is, I think, one of the places that Google shines. Also, the fact that it's a very accessible form. It does work well with screen readers and that kind of thing. So it's often a preferred way of sending out a survey or a form as well. When you first fill in create a form, as the creator of the form, you'll see at the top that you have questions and responses will become available to you once there's at least one response. And you'll see how many responses are at the top. You'll also see whether you're accepting responses or not. You'll see a little toggle at the top and you can turn that off. Unfortunately, that's the only way you can turn off a form, is to just go in and manually turn off that little toggle. It'd be a nice feature to be able to set a time window, but it's not available. That is something available in D2L. So if that's really important to you, you may want to use the D2L survey tool. And then you also have the option to see a summary of all the results, which will give you pie charts and all kinds of visuals of the basic responses that you've received. You can see it by questions. You can see how people have answered by one particular question or by individual. So you can look at one participant's submission. But what's really the best thing about this tool is that you can generate very quickly a Google Sheet from this that works like has most of the functionality of, say, an Excel spreadsheet. You can create pivot tables, you can filter the results, you can use it however you like, and whatever ways that you like to use spreadsheets, you can use it from there. And this is how I go about doing the Q&A thing as well, is I share that spreadsheet with my students so that they can see the questions and answers that are coming in as they come along. So that's the way that I use it for that. I'm going to see if I can start sharing again, but if you just don't mind switching to the next screen. This next screen is about the file collection option that's available in Google Forms. So you can create that as a content type, or sorry, as a section type, field. And then you can say upload your image here. And what it does is it automatically creates a folder for each of the questions you have that have a file submission, and it puts it in your Google Drive right beside the form, so that you have a folder full of the responses that were submitted by file type. So these were images that were submitted by a class. But the thing I wanted to let you know is that we've created a template library of Google Forms, as well as we have Google Slide ones, icon library, a Google Docs template started as well. And these are all available to you as part of the teaching community here. And so I wanted to show you 3 of them really briefly, and I'll make it very brief just because we're running out of time. But the links are in the slides as well to that library. You can go browsing through it and see how you can use it. The one that I like a lot is the 2 stars and a wish, which is a really classic way of getting some reflection from students. So all it is what worked best, what did you enjoy most, and what could be improved. So it's 2 good things and a not so good thing, or something that could be improved. So 2 stars and a wish. Very simple one that you can make anonymous or not anonymous. If it's not anonymous, that you could use it as a way of gauging participation. And again, as they fill it in, their names will show up. And I believe there are ways to import that list into D2L, which I won't get into today, but you can reach out to the courses folks if you'd like to get help with that in the DMP. So you can go to courses@ryerson.ca and they can help you with importing a CSV file into your grade book. So you can actually connect it that way. I personally have one spot where I put all the participation marks. So we do it manually. I get the students to just, my TAs to actually put them in for me, but they have a list and they can put it in order. So it matches the order in D2L and they can just sort of check and go through quickly. This one's for an assignment Q&A. So this one has a lot of instructions at the top. So the top of the form will include, when you get the template, all the instructions for how to set it up for you. And then you can delete those instructions before you share it with your students. And then once it's ready to go, you'll notice it does have that little wait before you submit. Be sure that you've checked all the different places you need to look for the actual answer. Double check that you don't already have the answer before you ask a question. And then when you click next, it just takes you to a page where you can write your question. Once you have it all set up and you have submissions, you can then share at the top of the form. So if I go back a step here, at the top of this form, I would actually create a link in the description of the form at the top, which would take the students to the actual results. In that spreadsheet that I generate, I can also add another column that just says response, and I just type in my responses there. So I get all the questions coming in automatically into that form, and then I could just provide the responses in the form as I need to. I can also say see line 4 if it's a repeat question, for example. And finally, I have one that is an activity. So it starts with a Google Doc that explains, pick one of these things and put the names of the people in your group beside it. And then you're going to go through a form to sort of look at this resource and provide some reflection on what this resource, how this resource is set up and information you can get from it. And then the recorder for the group, so everyone gets a role in the group and one person's the recorder, will actually fill out the Google form. And it brings up a form here where you could actually, I could have a video that explains what we're looking for, gives a demo, and then what's 3 things you learned. It basically brings you to a form that you can fill in, and you could customize it to whatever you want it to be asking the students. So the last thing I wanted to let you know in the slides that we have here is a comparison between Google Forms and a Brightspace tool that might be similar, or a supports tool that might be similar as well. So just so you know, this is here, so you can use it as a way of considering which tool would be the better choice for you. So I'll just hand it over now to Stephanie to go ahead and start with her presentation. And what I'll do in the meantime is I'll see if I can get I'll sign out and sign back in and see if I can get my demo available, and I'll try and do it before we end today.
Okay, so I think let's skip ahead to the few slides, and then we'll jump back in when Sally's back up and running. So we've seen a few examples of the ways that we can use Google in our classes, and we're going to see more once Sally comes back. But part of the setup is figuring out how to share the resources with the students. And this usually takes into account a couple of different things. One is, how do we want to organize the things that we're sharing? How do we want to group them in our own Google Drive? And then also, how do we actually want to share it to the students and with what level of access? So while we can always share an individual Google Doc with each of our students, I'm going to show a workflow for using Google Groups and Google Drive to create a shared folder for your class. This workflow is ideal for any of you who are thinking you might want to rely a bit more heavily on Google resources or Google collaborative activities. If you're only sharing one Google Doc with your class, I wouldn't recommend going through this whole process, because if you don't need a Google group just to share one file, it's more work than it's worth. But for those of you that are thinking of expanding your use of Google further, this could be a good way to save some time in the long run. So the first thing that you'll need to do is request a course-based Google group. And I think before I go into it, I'm curious to know, out of everyone that's here, if you could type into the chat yes or no, how many of you have already used a class-based Google group for communicating and sharing with your class? Great, so we've got a mix, and mostly no's, which is actually great, because we're going to go over some things that maybe you haven't wanted to do before or didn't really realize it would be a benefit. So basically, a course-based Google group has the student membership based on their enrollment in your course section. And so that means that as the students add or drop your course, they'll be automatically added and dropped from the Google group as well, similar to your D2L Brightspace course. Once you've connected the section number with your D2L shell, the students add and drop. And the course Google group, you set it up based on a specific course section of students, and those are the students that are in there. And so currently the process for getting a course Google group is to go through the my.ryerson.ca portal and go to self-serve and fill out a request form. We realize that more and more people are starting to use the course Google groups, probably because we've been recommending it over the last year and a half. And so our teams are working on making this process a little bit simpler. So, keep an eye on that for next year. But for this year, we do still have to fill out the request form. And so once you're in self-serve, Basically, you're going to the same section, kind of general area as you would to request a D2L Brightspace shell. And there is a form there to request a Google group or mailing list. And so the request form looks kind of like what I've got in the image on the right-hand side. And you're probably wondering why I'm showing an image rather than demoing this. And that kind of goes to my next point. You can really only request a class-based Google group if RAMS already knows which course sections you're teaching. So that means that someone like me who's not teaching this term, I have no options for requesting a course Google group because I have no sections in RAMS for this term. And also it makes it a little bit more difficult to create these well in advance, because if RAMS hasn't already put your section in there and assigned you as the instructor of that section, you can't request the Google group. And so that's why I've got an example in a screenshot here. And as you can see on the image on the right, the basic premise is that you select that you want a course group type, you specify which term, and then your RAM sections will be listed, and you can check the boxes for any RAM sections that you want to be a part of that one group. So again, similar to D2L Brightspace, if you check all of the boxes for all of your classes, you're going to get one really big Google group, because one form equals one Google group. But if you check, just the sections for one particular course, then you'll get a Google group just for that section of students. And so, as I mentioned before, if you haven't already been attached to your courses in RAMS yet, you won't be able to request the Google group right away. Unlike Brightspace, you can't do that in advance, but the rest of this workflow can still be done in advance. So even if you aren't able to request the Google group first, you can set up your folder structure first. And then when you're able to request the Google group, then you can do that final step of requesting the Google group and sharing with the students. So once you have a Google group, what can you do with it? So some of the sort of automatic things we think of with Google group are sending emails, using a group calendar, but some of those things, maybe we're not as interested in doing those things because we already use D2L Brightspace as our hub. Maybe we send email through that. Similarly, the group's landing page may not be as useful for your class because you've already got that landing page in D2L Brightspace. So where things get more interesting is when you can start thinking about sharing resources with your students and creating collaborative activities where the students can participate. So we've got tools like Google Forms, Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Jamboard, and other Google tools that you can all have those all reside in a single Google folder. So as we're going to see, the folder can house a number of different kinds of things. And this is the kind of thing that I'll be focusing on here. So if you see in the screenshot here, this is an example of the kind of email that you would get after you've requested your Google group. And you'll see a group username is listed there. If it's a course-based one, it's based on your course code, term, and then a unique identifier at the end. That does not refer to what your section number is. Similar to D2L Brightspace, it's just a sequential number that gets added to the end. And so this is the username for that group. And similarly, if you look on my screen on the left, this actually becomes an email address. So this weird collection of numbers and letters, which references our course code and term, that becomes an email address. And it's similar sharing to your Google group as it is when you're sharing with individual students. So instead of putting in an individual student's email address when you're sharing, we're going to be putting in this email address instead. All right, so I'm going to move away from the slides for a little bit just to show you some things in Google Drive itself. And we're going to take a look at a couple of different types of folder sharing. So the first level is view access, when you want to share course materials with the students, but you don't want the students to be able to modify them or remove them from the folder. The second is edit access, when you want the students to be able to modify the contents of the folder and collaborate on class activities within the folder. And so for that, I'm going to go to my sample folder in Google Drive. And you'll see I've got some some folders set up in advance just to sort of save some time during the session. But for anyone that's never used Google Drive before and you don't know how to create a folder, basically you would just go to the top left corner and click on New and click on Folder. And that would, once you type in the name, you'll get something that looks like this. And so if you're sharing these folders with your students, you want to make it clear in the name of the folders what they're for. So, you know, I often use the word shared to identify which folders I've shared with other people and which ones I have not. And so that sort of helps me as an instructor understand my instructor folder is not shared with the students, so I can put some graded things in there. The other ones that I've shared with the class, I have put the word shared in there so I don't mistakenly put grades in there. And that's just for sharing resources and collaborating with the students. And so my default setup folder here has 3 subfolders. The first one is one where I've given the students view access. And this is my resource folder where I'll drop in materials that I want the students to be able to see but not change. The second folder is my class activity folder. I give the students edit access to this folder, which means that they can edit and modify everything in the folder, add files into the folder, modify the files within the folder. So you want to make sure that you think through the use of the contents of the folder before you give that level of access, because the students will have access to everything. The third one is my not shared with the students folder. That's just for me. And that way I can have one folder for all of my course things. And within that, I have the different shared and not shared folders. And so once you've got a folder created, you can set the sharing permissions by, you can click on the folder, right click on the folder, and click share. And so you can see that I'm the owner of this folder because I'm the one that created it initially. And you can see that Michelle and Sally both have editor access to the folder, which means that they can add any kind of files into the folder. They can modify the folder. They can modify the files within the folder. So in this case, I want to add my student Google group with read-only access so they can see the contents but not make changes to the folder. And so the first thing you want to do is make sure that you get that email address for your Google group from the confirmation email that you would have received. And in this case, I'm going to use a test Google group that I use for things. And so I'm going to paste that into this add people in groups field. And you can see that because I've done this before, it automatically pops up. And the first thing I want to point out is that by default, Google wants to give this group editor access to the folder. I don't want to do that with my students in this folder. I want to switch them to viewer access, meaning that they can view contents. Alternatively, there's also commenter access, which can be great if you're sharing Google Doc resources and you want the students to sort of pepper the file with contents. So in that way, there's some interaction on the document without allowing them to change the document itself. So in this case, I'm going to give them viewer access. And then you'll also see that there's a checkbox for notifying people, and you can add in a message. If you leave this enabled, it can send an email out to everyone to let them know that they have access to the folder. Normally, I uncheck this because when I'm sharing a folder with people, I'll usually follow up with an email to provide a bit more context and share some other things. And in your case, if you're sharing resources with the students, they may not actually need to access the folder itself. You might be taking the individual pieces and linking them into D2L Brightspace, in which case they don't need to know about the folder. They only need to know about the resources that you provide links to. So I'm happy with this setup now, and I'm going to click share. Okay, so I've made that change. So now I have a class folder that's shared with my students. So I'm going to double click on the folder name just to go into it. And in this folder, I can add documents. I can add PowerPoint files and Word documents and things like that. I'm more interested in creating Google documents and other dynamic content in Google Drive itself. Another thing that people have commonly been doing since we've gone remote is to upload their lecture videos and other video-based content. So I have a Zoom lecture video as an example in here. And so I'm going to walk through a pretty common workflow for sharing course materials and course videos in our next step. Before I do that, instructors ask all the time how to prevent students from downloading the content that they share with them in Google. We don't really recommend doing that because the students may not have the best internet connection, or they might be commuting, and downloading the material may be important for their learning experience. However, a lot of instructors do ask how to do it, so I will show you, with the caveat that we don't always recommend it. So in this case, I'm going to click on my Zoom lecture video. I'm going to right click and I'll click share again. And remember, before I was on the folder level, and now I'm on the individual file level. You can't set this permission for all of the files in a folder. You have to do it file by file by file. So one thing that you'll see that's different in this case is I've got this settings icon in the top right corner. And when I click on it, there's a new option here that you would not see on the folder level that says viewers and commenters can see the option to download, print, and copy. If I uncheck this, that means that if I give the students view access to the file, they won't be able to download it. Now, if you've given the students edit access, you can't prevent them from downloading it because they're editors. This is only applicable for commenters and viewers. Okay, so now I'll click done to make that change. Okay, so that's the basics of setting up your folders and the sharing permissions in the folders. The next thing that I want to show is that next part of the step where once you've got your folders, you've got some materials in the folders, how do you then link to them from D2L Brightspace? So I'm going to go to my folder first, because I want to show you a quick way to save the link to the document. So again, I'm looking at my Zoom lecture video example. I'm going to right click and I'm going to click on the Get Link option. And you'll see I've got the link listed here, and I can just easily click on the copy link button to save it to my computer clipboard. Now, once you have it, if you're worried that there are a few too many steps in between and you might lose the link, you can paste it into a text editor or leave this window up until you're done. But I'm going to take the next step immediately, so it's copied into the clipboard, or sort of the memory of my web browser. And so now I can go to D2L Brightspace. Of course, it's been long enough that it wants me to log in again. Okay, so once I've come to my course, I go to the content area where I've already got some content modules set up, and I'm in my Teaching with Google module because that's what we're doing today. So if you have a link to any type of Google Doc, whether it's a video, a Google Doc, a Google Sheet, Google Drawing, and you've got that URL, you would then come to Upload and Create and click on Create a Link. So I'm going to call this Week 1 Zoom video, and then I'll paste in that URL that I saved to my clipboard into the memory of my browser. And then you can decide whether to open as an external resource or not. Some instructors prefer, especially with the videos, to have them displayed right in D2L Brightspace. So I'm going to do that for now. But sometimes having it open as an external resource can make it a little bit easier for the students that have multiple Google accounts, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I'll click Create. And so now you can see my video is embedded there. If I go back through, this is my content area. Again, you'll see the link is listed there. So that's basically how you would link the resources into D2L Brightspace. And before I hand it back over to Sally, just one quick tip. And I'm just going to mention this briefly. We've got instructions online, so you and your students can go through them in more detail. But sometimes when people try to access a Google resource, either from Brightspace or from an email link, they get this message that we see in the image on the side here. You need access, request access. This often happens because the person trying to access it doesn't only have their Ryerson Google account, but also a personal Google account. And so we've got a workflow to have people either log out from the other accounts or add their Ryerson account into their Google settings, and then a login process to get their session with Google and with Brightspace. And you'll see in our list of resources at the end of the slides, this link is there. Please share it with your students because it'll save you so many headaches when you're sharing resources with the students throughout the semester.
And so I'll skip back through all the way to the end and let you know that we have additional resources for you. So everything we've talked about today, and there's lots of guides and resources available about that. Remind you again that we have those templates available if you'd like a starting point. That's always nice to start with a template so you don't have to start from scratch. You can always adjust it and make all the changes you want. And you might remember from earlier on that Michelle shared that tip about putting /preview /template/preview at the end of any Google Doc, or even your Google Forms, you could do that. So if you want to make a form that your students can use or share one, you can add that /template/preview at the end, and they'll just see a button to say use this template and be able to use it and never touch the original. So that's available. There's also a few other tricks and tips for adding a / something else at the end. It's like a /preview /copy, all these different things you can just add to the end of a URL of any Google app generated file. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.